Jordan Brand just signed Clark and Sophie Cunningham to a combined $100 million deal, and the WNBA is erupting in a way that the basketball world has not seen since the original Clark commercial announcements that redefined what women's basketball commercial partnerships could look like, because this specific deal is not simply a commercial event of historic scale in women's sports. It is a structural statement about the commercial architecture of the Clark and Cunningham partnership that changes how every brand, every broadcast entity, and every institutional stakeholder in women's basketball's commercial ecosystem needs to think about the competitive and commercial future of the sport's most important individual relationship. $100 million. Split between two players. On the same roster. Through the same brand. In the same deal structure. That is not two separate endorsement agreements that happen to involve the same brand. That is a deliberate and specific commercial decision to invest in the Clark and Cunningham partnership as a joint commercial proposition rather than as two separate individual commercial assets, and the institutional implications of that specific commercial decision for the governance and the commercial architecture of women's basketball extend far beyond the headline number into the structural territory that the mainstream coverage is not examining with adequate analytical depth. Today I am breaking down exactly what the Jordan Brand combined deal means commercially, why the specific structure of a joint deal rather than two separate deals is the analytically significant detail that changes the entire story, what the WNBA's institutional reaction to the announcement reveals about how the league's governance apparatus is processing the specific commercial and institutional implications of what Jordan Brand has just formalized, and what $100 million going simultaneously to Clark and Cunningham tells every other brand and every other player in women's basketball about where the commercial development of this sport is heading and at what speed. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific element of the deal structure that nobody in the mainstream coverage has identified, and that reveals the most important thing about what Jordan Brand is actually betting on with this investment. The commercial history of women's basketball is a history of individually significant deals that existed in relative isolation from each other, commercial relationships between brands and players that reflected those brands' assessments of individual player value without reflecting any systematic or institutional understanding of how player commercial partnerships in women's basketball could be structured to capture the specific commercial dynamics that distinguish the sport's commercial moment from anything it has previously experienced. The Clark era began changing that history with the original Nike deal, continued changing it with the Jordan Brand individual partnership, escalated through the Adidas investment in Cunningham's individual commercial profile, and has now produced the single most structurally significant commercial development in women's basketball history with the combined $100 million Jordan Brand deal that formalizes the Clark and Cunningham partnership not just as a competitive relationship on the basketball floor but as a joint commercial proposition in the footwear and athletic apparel market. The specific commercial logic that makes a combined deal rather than two separate deals the right structure for this investment is the logic that Jordan Brand's commercial team has been developing ever since the Clark and Cunningham partnership became the most visible and the most documented individual relationship in women's basketball during the most commercially significant season the sport has ever produced. Two players whose commercial profiles individually represent genuinely exceptional value in the women's basketball market produce a combined commercial proposition that is not simply the sum of their individual values but something multiplicatively more powerful than either individual deal could generate. And the $100 million combined figure is Jordan Brand's formal commercial assessment of what that multiplicative value actually amounts to in the current market. Let us start with the deal structure specifically because the joint nature of the $100 million investment is the analytical foundation of everything that follows, and the mainstream coverage has been treating the combined figure as simply an impressive total number rather than examining what the joint structure reveals about the commercial thesis Jordan Brand is betting on with this specific investment. Joint commercial deals between two players under the same brand umbrella exist in the history of men's basketball, but they typically involve players on different teams whose commercial association is built around complementary market demographics or geographic reach rather than around a documented and publicly validated competitive and personal partnership of the kind Clark and Cunningham have built. What Jordan Brand is investing in with this specific combined deal is something that has no precise precedent in the history of athlete commercial partnerships at this scale, which is the commercial proposition of two players whose relationship with each other has been the defining narrative of the most commercially significant season in their sports history, whose competitive partnership on the floor has produced the most statistically documented joint excellence in their league's history. whose individual commercial profiles are each genuinely significant in their own right, and whose combined commercial proposition is more valuable than the sum of the individual parts specifically. Because the documented partnership gives both brands and consumers something that no individual commercial deal can provide, which is the authentic and publicly validated story of two elite athletes whose commitment to each other has been demonstrated repeatedly under the most commercially significant and the most personally costly circumstances either of them has faced. That is what Jordan Brand is buying for $100 million, not two separate player endorsements but one specific and commercially irreplaceable partnership story, and the deal structure is the commercial instrument that makes that specific investment possible. Now let us talk about the WNBA's institutional reaction, because the specific nature of how the league's governance apparatus is processing the announcement is as analytically significant as the announcement itself and reveals something important about how the institutional management of women's basketball is currently thinking about the relationship between the league's commercial development and the individual commercial power that its most significant players are building independently of the league's institutional commercial framework. The WNBA's eruption over the Jordan Brand combined deal is not simply the institutional excitement of a league watching its most prominent players achieve commercial milestones that reflect well on the sport they represent. It is a more complicated institutional response that reflects the specific tension between two things the league's governance apparatus is simultaneously experiencing. The first is genuine commercial pride in what Clark and Cunningham have achieved, because the $100 million combined Jordan Brand investment is itself a commercial validation of the transformation the Clark era has driven that reflects well on the league as the institutional context in which the transformation has been produced. The second is genuine institutional concern about what the specific structure of a joint deal between two players under the same brand umbrella means for the commercial and governance architecture of women's basketball going forward. A $100 million joint commercial deal that formalizes the Clark and Cunningham partnership as a single commercial proposition creates institutional realities that the WNBA's commercial governance framework was not designed to accommodate, and those institutional realities are what the league's governance apparatus is simultaneously celebrating and worrying about as it processes the announcement. But here is where the analysis needs to go deeper, because the institutional tension the WNBA is experiencing in response to the deal is itself a reveal about the specific governance and commercial architecture challenges that the Clark era has created for the league's institutional future. Now let us talk about what the $100 million combined deal means specifically for Sophie Cunningham, because her individual position in the deal is the element that the mainstream coverage is most under-examining, and that has the most significant implications for her own commercial future and for the model the deal creates for other elite players whose commercial profiles might benefit from similar joint deal structures. Cunningham's individual commercial profile entering this deal, the Adidas relationship we covered in a previous video, the specific commercial identity she has built through her public advocacy, competitive excellence, and documented partnership with Clark throughout the most dramatic season women's basketball has produced, is genuinely significant in its own right. Her individual commercial value is not a function of proximity to Clark but of a specific and authentic competitive identity that the season has documented in enough detail that major commercial entities have been competing for her commercial partnership on its own merits. But the specific commercial calculation that makes the Jordan Brand combined deal the right commercial vehicle for her in the current moment is the calculation that the joint commercial proposition she and Clark represent together is worth more to the right commercial partner than the individual deals she could generate separately. And Jordan Brand's $100 million commitment is the formal commercial confirmation that their assessment of the joint proposition's value exceeds the sum of the individual deal values they might have generated through separate negotiations. Cunningham's $50 million share of the combined deal, or whatever the specific split of the $100 million total her representation has negotiated, represents a commercial outcome that reflects both her genuine individual commercial value and the specific multiplicative premium that the joint proposition with Clark commands in the current market, and that premium is itself the commercial expression of everything the season has documented about why the Clark and Cunningham partnership is commercially worth more as a unit than as two separate commercial assets. Now let us zoom all the way out, because the $100 million Jordan Brand combined deal for Clark and Cunningham is not simply a commercial event of record-setting scale in women's basketball. It is the most specific and the most commercially complete expression yet of the fundamental transformation that the Clark era has produced in the commercial architecture of women's sports, and the specific structural innovation of the joint deal represents a commercial model that has permanent implications for how elite athlete partnerships can be monetized in women's sports going forward. Before the Clark era, the commercial architecture of women's basketball was built around individual player deals that reflected individual player value in a market where the commercial ceiling for any individual player's commercial potential was defined by the limits of women's basketball's commercial development as a category. The Clark era has shattered that commercial ceiling in ways that have created individual commercial value for Clark herself that exceeds any previous benchmark by orders of magnitude, and has created secondary commercial value expansion for the players most closely commercially associated with Clark's competitive ecosystem that represents a commercial development previously unavailable to any women's basketball player regardless of their individual competitive excellence. The Jordan Brand combined deal is the most concentrated and the most formally documented expression of that secondary commercial value expansion, formalizing in the most commercially credible possible form the specific partnership premium that the Clark and Cunningham relationship commands in the current market. Every elite player in women's basketball who has a documented and publicly validated competitive partnership with another elite player is now looking at the Clark and Cunningham combined deal as a commercial model whose applicability to their own situation they need to evaluate. And every major commercial brand in the athletic footwear and apparel market is looking at the same deal as evidence that the joint commercial proposition model deserves serious consideration in their women's basketball investment strategy going forward. Remember the deal structure element I mentioned at the start that nobody in the mainstream coverage has identified? Here it is. The specific element of the combined deal structure that reveals the most important thing about what Jordan Brand is actually betting on is the duration and the renewal provisions of the joint deal rather than the headline number. The specific term of the investment and the specific conditions under which it can be renewed or extended tell you whether Jordan Brand is betting on a specific current commercial moment or on a durable and long-term commercial partnership whose value compounds over time as the Clark and Cunningham relationship continues to develop. And the difference between those two commercial theses is the most important analytical detail in the entire deal structure. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about the Jordan Brand combined deal and why it matters beyond the immediate commercial impressiveness of the $100 million headline. The specific commercial infrastructure the deal creates for the Clark and Cunningham partnership represents a permanent and structural feature of women's basketball's commercial landscape that will shape every subsequent commercial conversation in the sport for years regardless of what competitive or organizational developments follow in the immediate aftermath of the announcement. A $100 million joint deal is not simply a commercial transaction between a brand and two athletes. It is the construction of a commercial infrastructure that includes marketing and promotional assets, content creation obligations and opportunities, product design collaboration structures, retail distribution relationships, and commercial activation platforms that together create a self-sustaining commercial ecosystem around the Clark and Cunningham partnership that grows and compounds over the life of the agreement rather than simply representing a static commercial value at the moment of signing. The construction of that infrastructure is what Jordan Brand is spending $100 million to create, and the specific commercial returns the infrastructure generates over the life of the agreement are what Jordan Brand is betting the $100 million investment will produce. The second hidden angle that nobody in the mainstream coverage is discussing is the specific implications of the combined deal structure for Cunningham's professional future and her negotiating position relative to the Indiana Fever or any subsequent employer. A player with a $100 million joint commercial deal with Jordan Brand has a specific and documented commercial standing that changes the institutional calculation of any franchise considering her roster value and her treatment within the organizational structure. Commercial deals of this magnitude create institutional leverage for the players who hold them that operates independently of the competitive leverage their on-court performance generates, and Cunningham's joint participation in a combined deal at this scale means her commercial standing is now formally documented at a level that makes her institutional treatment within any professional basketball organization a commercial question as well as a basketball question. My verdict on the Jordan Brand combined deal and what it means is this, stated without qualification. Jordan Brand signing Clark and Cunningham to a combined $100 million deal is the single most commercially significant joint investment in women's basketball history, and it is significant not simply for the headline number but for the specific commercial thesis the joint structure embodies, which is that the authentic and publicly validated competitive and personal partnership these two players have built is itself a commercial asset of specific and historically unprecedented value in the women's sports market, and the $100 million combined investment is Jordan Brand's formal institutional confirmation that the commercial value of that partnership exceeds any assessment that individual deals with each player could have generated by treating them as separate rather than as jointly constituted commercial propositions. The first reason this verdict is correct is the structural innovation. The joint deal structure represents a genuine commercial model innovation in women's sports that formalizes the commercial value of authentic athlete partnerships in a way that the standard individual deal framework cannot capture, and that innovation has permanent implications for how elite commercial partnerships in women's sports are structured going forward. The second reason is the commercial validation it provides. $100 million in joint commercial investment is the most specific and the most commercially credible validation of the Clark and Cunningham partnership's commercial significance that the market has yet produced, and that validation extends beyond the specific deal into the institutional credibility the partnership commands in every subsequent commercial conversation about women's basketball's development as a commercial category. The third reason is the model it creates. The combined deal structure the Jordan Brand investment establishes gives every other commercially significant athletic partnership in women's sports a model for how joint commercial propositions can be structured and valued in ways that capture the multiplicative premium authentic partnerships command beyond the sum of individual deal values, and that model has commercial implications for the sport that extend well beyond Clark and Cunningham's specific situation. The strongest counter-argument is that a $100 million combined deal that formalizes the Clark and Cunningham partnership as a joint commercial proposition creates specific financial and institutional dependencies between the two players that could become complicated if their competitive or personal paths diverge in ways that the deal structure was not designed to accommodate. That argument has genuine merit as a commercial risk assessment. The counter to the counter is that the specific documentation of the Clark and Cunningham partnership across the most dramatic season in women's basketball history provides the commercial foundation for a deal structure of this kind precisely because the partnership has already been tested under the most commercially significant and personally costly circumstances either player has faced and has proven durable enough to compound rather than diminish under that testing. So tell me in the comments right now, does the $100 million Jordan Brand combined deal for Clark and Cunningham represent the right commercial structure for this partnership at this specific moment in women's basketball's commercial development, and do you think the joint deal model it establishes will be replicated by other commercially significant athletic partnerships in women's sports in the years ahead? Drop your answer because I want to know exactly how this audience is reading the commercial and structural significance of what Jordan Brand just did. Here are my 3 predictions. First prediction, the Jordan Brand combined Clark and Cunningham commercial infrastructure produces a specific collaborative signature product within 18 months that generates the highest retail commercial performance of any women's basketball footwear or apparel product in the history of the market, not simply because of the individual commercial profiles of either player but because the joint commercial proposition the combined deal has formalized creates a retail commercial story that no individual product launch can generate with the same narrative power and the same audience reach. High confidence because the specific commercial infrastructure a combined deal at this scale creates is designed to produce exactly this kind of collaborative product as one of its primary commercial outputs, and the specific narrative power of the Clark and Cunningham partnership story provides the retail commercial foundation that gives any collaborative product launch access to an audience that neither player's individual commercial ecosystem can reach as completely on its own. Second prediction, at least 2 other major commercial brands announced structured partnerships with women's basketball player partnerships within 60 days of the Jordan Brand combined deal announcement, using the deal as the commercial validation and the structural model for their own investment in documented athlete partnership propositions in the women's sports market. Medium confidence because the commercial validation $100 million deal from Jordan Brand provides to the joint athlete partnership model is the kind of institutional evidence that accelerates commercial decision-making by other brands who have been evaluating similar investment structures, and the specific timing of the announcement relative to the all-star commercial momentum creates conditions that make commercial decisions of this kind more likely to happen in compressed timeframes than they typically would. Third prediction, and this is the bold one, the commercial success of the Clark and Cunningham joint deal structure permanently changes the standard commercial framework for elite women's sports athlete endorsements within 5 years, producing a new industry standard in which the joint commercial proposition model the deal has pioneered represents a recognized and formally structured commercial category that commercial entities evaluate alongside individual deals when assessing their women's sports investment strategies. Low confidence on the specific timeline because commercial industry standard changes of this kind require the accumulation of commercial performance data across multiple deal cycles and multiple market conditions before they achieve the institutional status of recognized industry standards. But the specific commercial significance of the Jordan brand investment provides the institutional catalyst for exactly this kind of industry standard change in a way that no previous women's sports commercial development has provided. Remember that duration and renewal provision detail? The specific term of the combined deal and the conditions under which it can be renewed or extended are the elements that tell you whether Jordan brand is betting on a current commercial moment or a long-term partnership value that compounds over time. And the answer to that question is the most important analytical detail about what the $100 million investment actually represents as a commercial thesis about the future of women's basketball. Watch for 3 things specifically going forward. First, track the specific commercial activations the Jordan brand combined deal produces in the weeks following the announcement, and specifically whether the initial marketing and promotional content built around the deal emphasizes the partnership story as its primary commercial narrative or leads with individual player excellence in a way that treats the joint deal structure as a commercial vehicle rather than as a commercial thesis. Because the specific commercial narrative Jordan brand deploys in its initial deal activations will tell you whether the joint structure represents a genuine commercial innovation built around the partnership proposition or simply a bundling of 2 individual commercial deals under one financial structure. Second, watch other major commercial brands' public communications about women's basketball commercial investment in the period following the announcement, and specifically whether any brand explicitly references the Jordan brand combined deal as influencing their own thinking about the structure and the scale of their women's basketball commercial partnerships, because any such explicit references would be the most direct available evidence that the deal is producing the commercial model innovation effect the joint structure is designed to create. Third, watch Clark and Cunningham's own public communication about the combined deal and specifically whether either or both of them articulate anything about what the joint structure means to them beyond the financial significance of the investment, because any articulation of what the formalization of their commercial partnership as a joint proposition means personally and professionally would be the most authentic available expression of what the $100 million deal represents at the human level of the story underneath all the commercial and institutional analysis. In my next video I am going deep on the full commercial architecture of the joint Clark and Cunningham commercial proposition as it now exists across the Jordan brand deal, the individual commercial relationships each player maintains, and the specific commercial opportunities the combined infrastructure creates that neither player's individual ecosystem could access independently.